Hello, I'm Ben Purser, the Vice President for Geostrategic Risk here at the Institute for Security and Technology. We're a West Coast-based think tank exploring the intersection of technology and security. Before I joined at IST, I spent almost 2 years at Meta, first on Sheryl Sandberg's strategic response team, and then on Nick Clegg's governance team. Before joining Facebook, I worked for the US government for 15 years, finishing my service as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. I had previously served as a professional staff member for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, an intelligence officer, and a member of AmeriCorps. Before joining the government, which I did after 9/11, I spent the better part of 3 years in China, where I was ultimately managing the Shanghai office of a consulting firm. And it's China that we're discussing today. IST's Strategic Balancing Initiative, or SBI, which I have the privilege of leading, works to overcome public-private misalignments in the technology development ecosystem in order to accelerate American economic competitive advantage with China. We do that by iteratively bringing together leaders in technology and government to discuss, under the Chatham House rule, shared goals and challenges. In between these conversations, we at IST conduct deep research on the takeaways from these discussions to allow for the follow-up conversations to build on both those discoveries. For example, we have working groups on energy and quantum, and in December, we're adding one on biotech. We meet with leaders of both US and foreign firms, including companies based in other members of NATO and the Quad. Ultimately, we plan to share our findings next summer in a capstone event with both in-person and virtual participation. Part of this work is an exploration of how policies of balancing can be achieved, what the trade-offs can be, and how those processes can go. It's in that spirit that we're going to ask a few questions today, or rather that Pav is going to ask some questions today. So I'm going to pass to him and turn off my camera. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you to Sophia, Lillian, Katie, Phil, and yourself for putting this event together at IST. As Ben mentioned, I'm Pavneet Singh. I'm an adjunct fellow here at the Institute for Security and Technology. I've had the fortune of working on US-China relations for much of the past 2 decades, and I've witnessed how, at various times, the focus of the relationship has shifted from the political to the military to the economic domains. I think it's safe to say today that the relationship with China is characterized by heightened competition across all three, from activity in the Taiwan Straits to the South and East China Seas, to the robust economic competition in countries around the world. In focus for today's event is the vibrant competition over leadership in emerging technology domains and the methods by which nations can cultivate and expand their competitive positions. Nations, not only the US and China, but predominantly the US and China, are working hard to sponsor indigenous capabilities and gain control of the commanding heights of what we call the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This will be propelled by overlapping advances in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech, cyber, autonomous systems, and others. A key driver supporting competitiveness in advanced technologies is private investment capital into high-tech industries of the United States and allied countries. This is a world that is dominated by venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, and technologists. The startup ecosystem has historically been an undercovered domain of the US economic activity and of little geostrategic importance for policymakers. While most recognize Silicon Valley as a technological hotbed, very few paid much attention to how technology companies were funded, how much funding they required, over what time frame, who provided the funding, and what information and rights the funders received in exchange for their checks. But as state-backed actors like China have become peer competitors, and as technology has advanced to service both military and civilian use cases, policymakers have taken notice. In the past 5 years, the US government and its allies have instituted several new policies to increase scrutiny of early-stage tech investments. These include the reform of CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, various export controls, executive orders on outbound investments, and the creation in Congress of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. It's important to note that these actions are not happening in a vacuum. PRC leadership is also taking action, both independently and in response to US and allied actions, to strengthen their own position. It will be important to understand the wider context of US actions in one sector for the broader relationship. That's why I'm delighted today to welcome our two distinguished guests that have each shaped the contours of the US-China relationship through their various perches, both in the private sector and the US government. Mike Brown is a managing partner at Shield Capital, a venture capital firm that focuses on investing in dual-use technologies. He is the former head of the former director of the Defense Innovation Unit at the Department of Defense, where he focused on identifying, adopting, and transitioning commercial technology into the hands of the military and the broader national security apparatus. Mike is also the co-author of the 2018 DIU report examining China's technology transfer efforts, with a particular focus on early stage investment. Prior to that, Mike was the CEO of two publicly traded tech companies, Symantec and Quantum. I am also thrilled to welcome my former colleague, Ambassador Craig Allen, who is currently the president of the US-China Business Council, where he represents over 200 American companies doing business in China. Prior to joining the Business Council, Craig had a distinguished career where I was fortunate to be his colleague in the US government. His titles ranged from holding senior positions at the Department of Commerce and the Department of State. And very importantly, Ambassador Allen has a deep history in developing US policy towards China. So before we dive into the questions, what I'd like to do is invite both of you to introduce yourselves and give a little context on what brought you to your current positions, your interest in the US-China relationship, and perhaps a little on how you've seen the relationship evolve over the last decade, or perhaps more. So with that, why don't I turn to Craig first? And let me just do one bit of housekeeping, which is please feel free to type questions into the chat, and near the end of the session, we'll start doing Q&A from the audience. So over to you, Craig.
Well, thank you, Pav. What a privilege to be here with Mike Brown. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I was a diplomat for 33 years, focused mostly on China. And I resigned on the day that Donald Trump said trade wars are good and they're easy to win, and was lucky enough to move over to the US-China Business Council. We work very closely with both governments, trying to advocate on behalf of American companies, workers, farmers, and ranchers who do business in China, trying to expand American exports to China and ensure that we have a more level playing field in the world's largest market, or one of the world's largest markets going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Mike, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Pav. Thanks for having me here. And Craig, it's a pleasure to be here in this podcast with you as well. I think one thing we should say up front is that we're probably going to focus the conversation today on technology. And just before we started the podcast, I had a chance to just go refresh myself on some of the data of how much our technology exports, total exports from the US to China. Craig's probably already familiar with, he wouldn't have had to look up as I did. About 150 billion worth of exports from the US to China. And what's in electronics and electronic manufacturing is only 10% of that. Probably all technology, I'm taking a guess from looking at the other categories, would be well under 20%. So we're going to be talking about the head-to-head competition, as Pav alluded. But I think we should keep in mind that that is, in my mind, primarily limited to technology products. That's where the real competition is that bleeds over into military uses of technology, et cetera. So this isn't about soybeans, lumber, and the other $100+ billion of exports to China. Well, a little bit about what brought me here. Pav mentioned that I was the co-author of a DIU report. Pav is the other co-author. So I've had the privilege of working with Pav for the last 7 years, and he's really broadened my horizons about all things geopolitical. So we had the privilege of working on this DIU report. It opened my eyes, and I think Pav's too, to the fact that China has a very systematic, long-term, comprehensive view on how to bring technology to China, because Xi has a view that he doesn't want to rely on bought or stolen technology. He wants an indigenous technology capability. In fact, he's pretty much said in so many words that he would like to displace, China should displace the US as the economic and technology superpower. That's his goal. We should make no mistake that that is the aim. That's what puts us into the competition that Pav alluded to. So I think that's the backdrop for what's happening here in technology. And of course, what the DIU report, if you take a look at it, what that opened up was that venture capital was yet another, at that time, really unknown pathway to bring technology back. We all know about buying companies. We know about cyber espionage. But this said that at the time, 15 to 18% of all US venture deals involved a Chinese investor, which means pretty clever way to get a nice scan of what's happening across the US technology sector. So it was investing in all of the same technologies US venture capital is investing in. And I think that is that opening of the view to China, looking at that as one of many vectors to bring technology in, kind of brings us to the situation today where we've had some response, they've responded to that, and we're still in a very heated competition over technology.
Thanks, Mike. And let's use that as a jumping off point. Maybe Craig, you've seen the evolution of the US-China relationship over the last 3 or 4 decades, where policymakers previously looked at China as a place where we would achieve our manufacturing goals. We'd send our low-value products and services there, and we would still lead in the high-value R&D and manufacturing, et cetera. In your new position, how would you characterize where China is in terms of capability, and how should we reframe what we are dealing with?
Okay, well, let's just take a couple seconds to do a level set. China has about 18% of the world's population. And I'd like to provide another couple numbers around that. China has about 17% of world GDP. So on average, China is a little bit less wealthy than the average citizen of the world. But China has 12% of global consumption. They terribly underconsume, but also 30% of global investment. Let me repeat that, 30% of global investment. And so they oversave and overinvest. And we have seen the fruits of that distortions very, very clearly in overcapacity in a good number of industries. If you look at more of the traditional industries, China has 50% of capacity in steel, approximately the same in aluminum, more than that for solar panels and wind and new energy vehicles, significantly more than that. And to a certain extent, that is a result of overinvestment and the flip side of that, under consumption. So China is a major market. China per capita is at per capita income at about 12 to 13,000 on a nominal basis, at about 18,000 on a PPP basis, middle class of about 400 million. And this middle class really likes American products, and they are consuming both the products and the services very effectively. And there's a lot more that we could sell to them. I would note that since the May 4th movement of 1919, so for 100 years, what Mike said has been correct. The Chinese have been focused on science and technology upgrading. But that has recently really received a tremendous amount of resources and investment is being thrown into this. And that is very true on a human level. The talent in China is quite extraordinary. By some measurements, China has 8 times as many STEM workers as the United States. They're pumping them out at 4 times the rate of the United States. And I would say that Chinese companies are very, very innovative. We have to relieve ourselves of the fallacy that their successes are due to copying and espionage only. It's due to hard work and throwing an awful lot of resources at the talent and the technology and the companies to certainly rival the United States. And indeed, I would agree with Mike that the goal is to lead the next curve, the next wave of technology. But this is extremely complex, as our two countries are deeply integrated, highly synergistic, and highly interdependent. So we need to approach this problem with nuance and careful understanding. Otherwise, we're going to trip ourselves up. Thank you.
Yeah, Craig, these are excellent points. And I think later in the discussion, we'll get into kind of what are the policy tools that exist right now. But I think the point that you underscored is that their innovative capacity is on par with the United States, or it's nearing what the United States has, and they're allocating several resources across the innovation stack, whether it's funding or students. They're making every effort to get the lead in some of these industries. I think this is a good, maybe a good way to ask Mike, in the field of dual use technology or advanced and emerging technologies, are you seeing Chinese companies, investors leading in certain areas or on par in specific areas that are of concern to the United States? And kind of what are the trend lines there?
Well, I'd say as a partner of Shield, we're not seeing Chinese entities because we're investing in AI and cyber. Those fields don't typically need Chinese money. And we're also investing in space and autonomy. Both of those markets are ones where the U.S. government is going to be a pretty large customer. So those companies in those sectors are pretty sophisticated and know they shouldn't be taking Chinese money if they want to be selling to the U.S. government. But I think as Pav knows from work we've done together, there is an area of hard tech of interest to Chinese investors that would be beyond those that the government might be a very large customer. So let's say battery technology as one. These are sectors where traditionally it's been a little more difficult to attract venture money. Why? Because it might take me longer to develop these technologies because they might be more capital intensive. The technology may be a little less certain. Venture capitalists, if we speak in general about the whole class of venture capitalists, are much more interested in how can I commercialize a technology that's already developed? How can I really minimize my risk by taking something to market that doesn't require much technology development, and particularly in software, because that's more lucrative. So that leaves a class of technologies where I think traditionally China has been very active because they've been one of the most aggressive investors. So whether that's quantum sensors or batteries or other deep tech, hard tech technologies. So that's where I think China has traditionally tried to exploit that gap in U.S. financing. And Pav, as you know, from the work that we did several years ago, China's overall investment in technology, despite the actions that we've taken to strengthen export controls, strengthen CFIUS through the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2018, that has not slowed China down from a dollar standpoint in terms of their investment in technology. It's still, according to Bloomberg and according to the Rhodium Group, dollar-wise, it's still about the same level it was 7 years ago when we did this study. And that, I think, speaks to the fact that that is what China wants to invest in and then have access to in terms of adding to their own indigenous base over time. So while I see the overall trend towards foreign direct investment come down, we've had CEOs of companies like Dalian Wanda detained in China, spent too much of the national resources buying movie theaters and the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and that sort of thing. That activity is curbed dramatically. But China's interest and actual dollar investment in tech has stayed pretty consistent from the late teens to today.
Yeah, Pav, I would just add that there's been a complementary slowdown on U.S. Venture capital, private equity, portfolio investment going into China. Some estimates are that in the first quarter of 2023, U.S. investments into China are down 90%, 90%. So we've seen a complementary slowdown on the financial flows going both ways.
And that's a good point. I think, coming back to, there's the economic conditions that might be slowing down investment, but there's also the geostrategic conditions, which are policies that both the US and China are implementing. Let me start with Mike. The reform of CFIUS to look at, in some cases, venture capital flows. Do you think that went far enough? And you've identified this space of hard tech, deep tech, where US investors are not inclined to invest, at the scale that they are for software. Has FIRMA affected that? Have we provided a runway for those companies to get capital that is not Chinese? How would you rate the current environment with respect to the reforms that were made?
So since I worked on those reforms, I'm very much a believer in them. But I would say, no, they didn't go far enough. If you think about CFIUS, it really is all about making sure that acquisitions of U.S. assets that could be important for national security have a check on them in our system to make sure that, a country we might be competing with, which would certainly include China, does not have access to something important to national security from an outright purchase. So what the reforms did was say, okay, it doesn't have to be an outright purchase or majority share. We can look at that as being more of a continuum and even look at minority interests if, in this case, China would have access to the underlying technology. So more than a passive investor, in other words. So CFIUS now has the authority to look there. It also broadened CFIUS to be able to look at real estate transactions. There were an unusually high number of real estate transactions where Chinese investors were looking to buy real estate adjacent to US military bases. That raised some eyebrows. So that's now covered in CFIUS. But CFIUS was not aimed at really reducing all the mechanisms of technology transfer. Here's where I don't think it went far enough. We should have CFIUS be reviewing the forced joint ventures that China requires if you're going to bring technology to sell into Chinese markets. They most often require that you're going to form a joint venture. This is what Tesla just did by gaining access to the Chinese market. China says, okay, well, you can't do that without entering into a joint venture. And my personal view is China uses that as a tool to be able to extract the technology from that joint venture. And I think that's happened in a number of cases. So this is where it didn't go far enough, where there's IP licensing agreements or joint ventures. That should also be part of the purview of CFIUS. So we're making incremental steps, but we didn't quite get there. I think the same thing could be true on the recent executive order that President Biden issued. I applaud the executive order for outbound screening, the counterpart to CFIUS, which is inbound investment screening. So that was limited, as we know, to 3 technology areas, semiconductors being one, AI being another. I think third was quantum sciences. But there are 19 technologies the National Security Council has identified as critical for national security. So why do we stop at 3 and not broaden this to all 19? Having said all of that, the most important thing we can do is invest in ourselves. These, I'll call them defensive measures of what can we do to make sure somebody's not taking advantage of technology that we've developed. I'm for them, but they only go so far. The only way to ensure that we really have the lead in these emerging technologies is to make sure we're investing in those technologies. That means R&D dollars. It means STEM talent that Craig referred to, that China is now producing many more STEM PhDs and graduate students than we are. That's the part that we need to take a look at. Are we investing enough in ourselves from basic R&D, setting the standards, making sure companies in these sectors have a fighting chance on the world stage, and through the talent development? I would argue we're clearly not.
That's great, Mike. Thank you. And Craig, maybe I could ask you to respond, but also add to that, are U.S. companies, when they're trying to do business in China, based on some of the actions that the U.S. government is taking or allied countries are taking, are they seeing reciprocal actions in China or independent actions in China? And how is that dynamic for U.S. companies doing business there?
So I'd like to go back to one of Mike's opening comments that 85-90% of U.S.-China trade and investment is outside of the national security area. American farmers and oil workers and et cetera, consumer goods companies are really outside of this debate. And I think that both on a CFIUS perspective, on an inbound perspective, it's useful just to remember that if we're going to take care of or reduce some of the trade imbalances, then we're going to have to welcome foreign direct investment into the United States outside of the technology area. And I think it's useful to be explicit about that. As noted, the Chinese have been very respectful and driving towards more technology and scientific expertise over the last 102 years, at least. Recently, I think that U.S. export controls, particularly the October 7, 2022 controls, have really put high octane gasoline in those engines, as the Chinese feel that they need to have indigenous capabilities in all of the technology areas covered. And so there's two ways that the Chinese do that. I think kind of an offensive and kind of a defensive way. The offensive way is to provide subsidies. Scott Kennedy at CSIS estimates the subsidies, industrial subsidies, at about 3% annually, 3% of GDP annually for tech subsidies. I think Barry Naughton at the University of California, San Diego, has done wonderful work here, and he comes out with a number of about 11% of GDP available for innovation subsidies. So this is massive. But I would just really rush to say that the subsidies are a part of it, but a small part of it. And I don't want to get beyond the bounds of our discussion here, but there's a whole panoply of industrial policies, including standards and intellectual property rights, government procurement, SOE procurement, and many other mechanisms, tools by which the Chinese government tries to tip the balance in favor of Chinese companies. And I think that from a Chinese government perspective, that's been reasonably successful in some areas. And I would point at EVs and new energy in particular. So the Chinese also have gone on the offense, albeit their own export controls have been really more symbolic than anything. Recently, there was export controls imposed on graphite used for batteries, germanium and gallium a couple of weeks ago. The Chinese have a lot of legal mechanisms to impose controls and induce pain for foreign companies, but they really haven't been used. And so while we see the legal measures that the Chinese government has put into place, we really don't see the active use of them at all in a kind of in a manner that would be upheld by the Chinese courts. Rather, most of the effort is on import substitution, using the Chinese market as a coercive mechanism to induce technology transfer or other behaviors that the Chinese government wants for a multitude of reasons, not only technology. There are many other objectives that the Chinese government is trying to reach, and those should be taken into mind. So I would say that the Chinese government hand on the economy and the hand on technology is much more, heavy than that of the U.S. government. There's no doubt about that, and that American companies have to work within those contexts as we try to expand our exports to China, to take part in Chinese economic growth, and to maintain our global economic leadership. I would posit that an American company can't be a global leader unless it's a leader in China. And I recognize that's a complicated concept, and that there are costs involved in that. But we have long-term global competitiveness issues that we need to be attentive to. And I would posit that if we depart China, if we give the Europeans, the Chinese, or the Koreans, or the Japanese, the scale, the speed, and the market of China, then we are not going to be globally competitive. This is a very complex dynamic, which my members are engaged in, and which we're discussing today. This is not a two-level chess. This is 7 or 8 level chess, and short-term, medium, and long-term might lead to different responses depending on what problem you're trying to solve. Thank you.
Well, Craig, those are all excellent points, and I think positioning us in the wider context always helps when you're designing policy tools. And I think policymakers that are listening are hopefully being attentive to that. I wonder if I could follow up just on a question about linkages. Do you find that when the U.S. imposes certain restrictions, whether it's on inbound or outbound investments from PRC-based entities, or tariffs for that matter, we did see kind of a trade war, so to speak, in the Trump administration that has a little bit carried into the Biden administration. But do you see it? What are the dynamics within the Chinese economy and your membership in dealing with some of potential linkages that might be there?
Well, we just completed a survey of our members, and it's freely available on the USCBC website. And it suggests that our members are becoming increasingly attentive to Chinese industrial policy. Some 60% of our members are concerned that Chinese industrial policy may affect their competitiveness on a global basis in 5 or 6 years, and up to 80% of our members are concerned that Chinese industrial policy might impact their competitiveness in the Chinese market within 5 years. So those are large numbers, and that it encompasses, but well exceeds the concerns of the tech industry, much more general than that. And so our members, 80% are profitable in China. We are responsible for most exports to China. We are committed to the China market for the longer term, but we're eyes wide open, very clear-eyed about the threats and the vulnerabilities that we have, but also want to be viable long-term global leaders throughout all the industries that we represent. And we feel strongly that to do that, we need to be a leader in China, and we're going to defend our market share and defend our interests and WTO rights in the China market to ensure as fair a level playing field as possible. Recognizing that this is fraught with complexity, but we've been doing it for 40 years. I expect that we'll be doing it 40 years from now. The key is the terms of trade and the terms of engagement between the two countries. And they are changing on a regular basis, particularly as the WTO and other multilateral institutions lose their efficacy in governing, particularly tech. Tech, I would agree with Mike completely. Tech is the key, the core element of the rivalry, and I am very sorry that the WTO is silent on most tech issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Craig. Now, maybe I could pivot, Mike. You're well aware, and you've outlined that the White House has identified 19 critical technologies. The Department of Defense has identified some subset of that. I wonder if you could, for our audience, kind of walk through why are these technologies critical, both for economic competitiveness and for national security, perhaps indexing on the national security side so people can understand why there's so much concern.
Well, let's take the ground zero for this, which is semiconductors. So this is a technology that actually the Department of Defense helped create back in the late 60s and early 70s. It was critical for the space program. At one point in the 1960s, the Apollo program consumed 1/3 of the output of the semiconductor industry. Kind of amazing that a government program would have consumed that much of a leading edge technology. The Defense Department was also critical in making early purchases to miniaturize electronics for nuclear weapons. So you could say Silicon Valley was basically built with the Defense Department, not only research dollars, but the fact that the department was an early adopter at that time. Okay, fast forward now to where semiconductor improvements have happened according to Moore's law now for the past 50 years. And now we have chips with more than 1 billion transistors. And we see that the application for that is just in everything that we use, from kitchen appliances to our cars. Everything is smarter because of chips these days. And they're still used for military applications. If we look at what allows for the satellite imagery that we're seeing that allowed us to see that the invasion of Ukraine was about to happen, even though Putin was denying it, all the way to how our munitions laser guided, on and on and on. There's so many military applications, even though it's a small part of the total output of the industry, absolutely critical. And the Defense Department would not be able to do what it does without chips. So perfect example, China realizes the same thing. That's why there's so much consternation over the fact that, most of the leading edge semiconductors are made on the island 90 miles offshore from China by TSMC. So we could go through another technology like artificial intelligence, which has been called out by Putin as whoever rules AI rules the world. She's made it a point to say that China is going to be leader in AI. And I think we can easily see that AI, while it can be used for so many productivity improvements in our life, generative AI is showing us that advantage. Those same advancements can also be used for military, because the military is also involved in sensor fusion, decision-making optimization, on and on. So this is why, appropriately, there's so much concern about these dual-use technologies. And the military, if we went back 50 years, was developing a lot of the technology it needed within its own labs, the national labs, Now, most of the technology it requires to operate comes from the commercial world. In the technologies we just talked about, semiconductors, AI, sensors, et cetera. They're not making that exclusively with defense contractors. So it's really flipped how defense needs to think about accessing technology. It's not inventing what it needs to access what's being developed in the commercial world if it wants to stay on top. China's very aware of that trend. That's the reason why they've invested so much in technology. They were very observant as we fought the first Gulf War, defeating the 6th largest army in the world in 6 days, very few casualties. And why was that? Tremendous impact of technology, satellite imagery, laser-guided munitions, on and on and on. They vowed at that point they were going to redouble their efforts on technology, and they clearly have. They've had the fastest military buildup in history as a result. So both governments are very aware of the key role technology plays, not only for ensuring a growing economy, but also for national security. And that's what makes this such a competitive space.
Well, if I could follow up, because I think this is an important question for both the audience to understand and kind of a meta question on how we think about governing in this new world. You point to the fact that many of these technologies are dual use. They're being developed by the commercial sector and then hopefully being adopted by the national security apparatus, which was a flip in the paradigm. How would you say the stakeholders in the private commercial world understand the phenomenons that you just described? For example, the venture capital investors or the limited partners that are investing in the venture capital who are then investing in the companies. Is there this recognition, this realization of how important their investments are? And then the bigger question is, it gets to financial incentives. There's only so much you can regulate. And if we're trying to maintain a market-based economy and the incentives that go with capital allocation, how can we tune those incentives so that investors understand where and how their investments become important?
Wow, that's a pretty big question, Tom. I think the venture capital community is aware. Ukraine has been a wake-up call. We're all watching the incredible dichotomy of World War I tactics with trenches being dug, but drones flying overhead, the use of commercial satellite imagery, a commercial company, SpaceX, Starlink, providing the communications backbone for the entire country at war. These are things that would have been unheard of a decade ago. So we're all seeing the role technology is playing in that war and thinking ahead to what does that mean for the future. I think the venture capital community has woken up. There's now a category in venture capital called defense tech. I'm a partner in a firm that is focused on defense tech. Whether that will pay off as a financial bet, it will not know for another decade or so, because it really depends on how well does the Department of Defense start procuring a lot of this technology. I hope we're seeing with Ukraine how important it is, and I think the DoD has recognized that with Kathleen Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, recently announcing something called the Replicator Initiative, wanting to bring more mass to the fight and leverage commercial technology. So all of that's yet to be seen in the future, but I think everyone is awakened to the importance of it. I'll just make one or two more comments about incentives. The incentives are not there yet. Number one, the department is not buying in a significant quantity commercial technology from many of the new vendors. 2/3 of the defense procurement today still is handled by 6 companies. We need those 6 companies to be successful, but we need a much wider base to be drawing on. We're seeing some of the perils of that in the fact that we've let certain capabilities like our munitions capability wither, and now we need it. So that speaks to the importance of incentives for defense. But the other incentive we need it goes back to the offense game we need to be playing to invest in new technologies. We have allowed our capital markets to be so short-term oriented. They reward behavior that is optimizing the last penny per share per quarter, not optimizing national capabilities. Here's where we need to watch what China is doing. They're planning for 2049, the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party's taking over of China, basically winning their war with the nationalists. So that means that they're planning a 25-year time horizon. and have goals set for the country in terms of what capabilities they want in place and adopted widely in the economy by that time. What do we have in the US as a comparison for that? Our national goals for 25 years from now. I don't hear any political candidate talking about that. So we have to think about, well, I don't want their system. I'm sure you and Craig don't either, but there are some advantages to doing some longer term planning and providing the resources to get you there. We saw that with when President Kennedy made the goal to take a man to the moon, and we accomplished it, an absolutely unbelievable feat given the state of technology at the time. We need that same imagination and will today to be thinking about what is our future, mostly from an economic prosperity standpoint, but that will in turn guarantee our national security. That's where I see a failing today of the incentives. We have to have the incentives in place to start thinking longer term. That's not only, tax policy, but how the SEC is measuring companies and what we're talking about in terms of measuring success in our economy.
And let me turn to Craig on this question of incentives and awareness. When your membership is doing business and entering the Chinese market, how has the awareness changed in terms of, are we selling to an entity that potentially could be servicing the PLA? Is this investor that we're partnering with on a JV, going to ultimately push us out, or is our business going to survive? I think the criticism has been in the past that U.S. companies were working hard to seek market access for all the reasons you've identified. But have you seen an evolution in how they understand the incentives and the short, medium, and long-term potential of their business?
Sure. This is, again, a question fraught with complexity. The U.S. companies are going to follow U.S. law, and we are very attentive to the complexities of the export control regime and all of its glorious Baroque complexity. And we follow it through and through. But I have to say that there is a cost to this. And the cost is that any unilateral American export control, and indeed, I will rush to say, any unilateral investment control is asymmetrically going to hurt American exporters and American investors if they are not multilateralized. And so we do not live in a bilateral world. We live in a multilateral world whereby if a certain technology is put on export controls, it immediately creates a global incentive structure to figure out how to recreate that same technology without any American inputs. And so when we put a new product or even a company on the entities list, then automatically we are increasing the incentives to make American companies suppliers of the last resort, to remove American parts and components from European or Japanese or Chinese technology, as other companies in Europe or Japan do not wish to be held to the tender mercies of the Department of Commerce and getting export control approval. So the incentive structures, very well funded by Chinese government and entities, are global, are systematic, and are quite effective at end running American export controls. And let us just do a true accounting here. Over the short term, that will have an impact on American company sales and their technological, their market share globally. Over the medium term, it will have an impact on those companies' ability to compete on a very competitive global market where God has not given us a mandate to be the leader for all times. That's a competitive issue, and globally, it may, if we are not careful, lead to a reduction in American competitiveness. Now, this is not abstract. We have seen the imposition of unilateral export controls lead to a severe reduction of the American commercial satellite industry and satellite electronics. And export controls were a part of that. Unilateral export controls. I just really want to have a true accounting here on both the benefits and also the costs. And I think that the benefits of export controls, that we're going to be able to keep them a couple of generations behind, well, I really question that. I don't really think that that's going to work out. And the costs, I think, are terribly understated. So let's do ourselves the favor of a true accounting and to follow our national interest, because we want to maintain competitiveness over the longer term, at least for the rest of Mike and my lifetime. And how to get there is intensely complex issue. We need to maintain American national security while properly weighting the importance of technological competitiveness and economic competitiveness in that mix. And right now, I'm not confident that we have that appropriate mix. Certainly, we don't have the multilateral mechanisms in place that we really need if we are to achieve our stated national security goals. Right now, I fear it's American companies that pay the costs, and I'm not sure what the benefits are in many cases. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. And maybe you've brought up a big issue that I know Mike and I have talked about a lot. It's what is in the art of the possible for multilateral collaboration or collaboration with allies. We know that currently the administration has embarked on various kind of quadrilateral, the Quad, AUKUS, and the US-EU. But it doesn't strike me that those entities necessarily deal with specific things like export controls in the way that, for example, the Wassenaar arrangement or the Australia group manage export controls. So from your perspective, and Mike, what is in the art of the possible, and what should we be aspiring to in terms of new multilateral or plurilateral organizations to achieve these things?
Let me just say that the Biden administration has really worked hard at this, and I think has, particularly on semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, has done much more than I would have anticipated, or certainly what the Chinese anticipated. But let's also not pretend that we're at a level of equivalency here. The Chinese do not have military end user, military end use. They don't have the American persons rule. They do not have the foreign product rule. So let's not pretend that we have an equivalency here. American companies are being held at a unilateral disadvantage in competing on the global market because of the export controls. And so I worry about that. I mean, at the end of the day, in my view, lacking an affirmative trade agenda such as the CPTPP or a free market agreement with the EU, we're really not going to be able to achieve what we are looking for. And indeed, we need to think much more boldly, and hopefully in the next administration, reach out for really much more comprehensive trade talks that would include the difficult issues of technology. Let's just recall my final word is that the US, the EU, and Japan together are about half of China's population, and we should keep that in mind. They have a scale, speed, and market that's very impressive. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Mike?
Well, maybe the counter to that is if you add their GDP together, a much more significant factor than China. Whereas if I completely agree with you, bilateral is not the way we should be approaching this. We're only slightly bigger than China's economy. We have to add the EU, Japan, South Korea, and our other allies. Then we're a significant factor and then can start to have an impact. Agree with you completely that these things need to be harmonized. The Wassenaar arrangement is not adequate to what we need today. You know, that comes out of the Cold War. We need to be rethinking the economic tools we have, all of which came out of the Cold War, to say, what do we really need for the world going forward? A great article in Foreign Affairs right now talking about the new economic state that highlights this. The tools that we have, the coordination mechanisms we have, all from the Cold War. So we should be rethinking that, because my personal belief is that unless we go to war with China, which we should be doing everything we can to avoid and deter China from taking action that would pull us into military conflict, we're going to be at this a very long time. Pav and I wrote an article several years ago called The Superpower Marathon to indicate how long we're going to be at this. So we have the time to think about what are the right tools, what are the right coordinating mechanisms, which in our economy need to bring in academia and the business community. China can do that by fiat, we can't. So we have to think about how we're going to do that. And as part of that, we have to harmonize these economic tools that we want to use, whether it's export controls or other mechanisms we want to put in place. Because you're absolutely right. We can't have the result of our actions be disadvantaging U.S. companies. But I do think the world is coming around to the dangers that China represents in the technology world that would allow us to work together in concert with allies. Let's face it, it's aggression that has strengthened NATO to be the strongest it's probably ever been. That's what brings the Quad together, the AUKUS arrangement. So events in the world are happening, not from our shaping, but from China and Russia, that create more of a need for allies, democracies to work together. So I have hope that if we reimagine these and work closely together with our partners, rather than thinking we have the, ability to do things unilaterally, we can get to the right place.
Fantastic. So I think the audience was entirely captivated with both of your presentations and interventions, because we did not receive any questions from the audience, or either that or they just enjoyed my questions so much.
Yeah, Craig and I doubt that you have the reason for no questions.
So I'll take my prerogative as the moderator here to wrap up. And really, I want to start by thanking Ambassador Craig Allen, Mike Brown. Both of you have devoted a significant portion of your life, both in the private sector and the public sector, to really giving the United States a competitive edge and ensuring that we have national security, economic prosperity into the future. What this conversation shows me is that even though we started with a focus on venture capital and the investment in the startup technology sector, you cannot really divorce that activity from the wider context of what is a economic relationship bilaterally, what is a economic relationship multilaterally, and how it affects national security, both domestically and abroad. Some of the key takeaways I heard today were, look, we've taken some actions on the defensive side. And of course, those are good actions. More can be done, but we shouldn't hinge on defense as the solution. We really need to think about this in the wider context of what are we doing to support our capability going forward? How are we developing our students? How are we developing our technology base? How are we supporting industry to compete in markets globally? There is a whole set of new tools that need to be contemplated. There are existing tools that need to be resuscitated and reformed. And we really need to start thinking about that over a longer horizon than we currently do today. I think the last thing that I took away from this was, there's a wider context in terms of how we deal with China. It's not just technology. It's technology, it's commodities, it's manufacturing, it's a range of things that can be affected if things in the relationship get more rocky. So we need to be very mindful, policymakers need to be very mindful about how do we balance what we are doing to achieve national security goals, economic goals with kind of what is in the bigger milieu. And then the last takeaway is, look, there's a lot more work to be done, and discussions like this, I think, are only the start. And I know Mike is working on several initiatives. I know Ambassador Allen is working on several initiatives to really get after these issues. So I want to thank everyone for their time. I want to thank IST and the team for putting this together. And please feel free to follow up at securityandtechnology.org, or I'm sure you can find us and send us questions. But really appreciate your time. And I think now we are going to end this